Hey there, everybody. Welcome to this BFI training sampler, HR Analytics, Predictive Intelligence for Workforce Strategy. Wow, that's a mouthful, and that's an ambitious title. My name is Jeff Wellstead, and my work over the past 2 decades spans really kind of three critical missions. Elevating HR leaders into strategic insight-driven partners through AI coaching and capability building. The other is guiding HR tech companies actually to design and scale ethical, people-centered AI solutions. And finally, championing skills-based organizations, as I think it's much more an issue where fluid skills-first talent models make a lot more sense these days than rigid job structures. So I'm going to be your guide today and your help and discuss how it is we can use large language models to basically leverage the existing data we have and actually create some incredible functionality. The current HR reporting, I think we can all agree, often kind of looks backwards at past performance. And it's not a bad thing, but it frankly doesn't help us with what's going to happen. And with the power of predictive analytics, we can actually start to look forward to anticipate future workforce needs, which is really, frankly, what our business needs, is to create some level of optimization and data-driven strategy around that. So this session will basically show you how to bridge that gap and unlock the full potential of your HR data to drive real business value. There's a lot on this page, but it's very, very useful. And of course, you'll be able to kind of reference it going forward. But this session is really kind of designed to equip you with the essential knowledge and the skills to kind of transform your HR function from a much more administrative, reactive group to a forward-looking, data-driven powerhouse is the idea. And sort of by the end of the session, hopefully you will have been empowered to identify cutting-edge AI analytics tools, which we'll get into, leverage large language models, or LLMs, as they're often referred to forecast critical HR needs, to model, financial impact of workforce changes and understand the ethical considerations and develop proactive strategies and integrate predictive HR intelligence into your strategic planning. This session marks a pivotal shift, taking your current HR reporting from being a descriptive, kind of backward-looking, two-dimensional view of things into something that's much more profoundly predictive. So I'm going to guide you through the blending of what I would call, I guess, robust analytics platforms with the flexibility and the generative capabilities of LLMs. And in this particular case, we're going to use ChatGPT-5. And I think this powerful synergy really kind of enables you to kind of like proactively forecast critical workforce dynamics like employee turnover, emerging skills gaps, potential talent shortages, which allow then for a much more targeted intervention before they kind of negatively impact the business. Predictive modeling in HR allows us to forecast future trends and issues basically before they become systemic problems. And aligning analytics to key business metrics, which is the key, always ever kind of align ourselves to business targets, business metrics, business problems, shows a much more kind of leadership approach in terms of the strategic value that HR data and our insights then bring. Okay. So we're so often, well, I think we're also painted with a brush perceptively that we are kind of a back office administration and compliance function. We want to basically hand that over to whatever level of automation we possibly can do, get out of that business, and instead be all about the business of driving the business forward. Okay. And we also want to team up with the finance department. We want to make sure that our models, our findings, if you will, based on the sort of analytics that we're running with the LLMs, are actually kind of syncing up with them. And importantly, to ask for their help in putting a monetary impact value on the things that we are discovering. Because again, identifying issues early, patterns that are emerging based on the data that we're basically able to collect on a regular basis and predict, the directions or the scenarios that may roll out is infinitely more interesting and useful, obviously, to our exec teams than not. So what if scenarios are kind of the way forward? Practical applications of these processes, these steps, I think that we'll always ever have to follow, and we always ever talk about this in every BFI course around AI in HR. We always ever want to kind of make sure that we securely extract relevant workforce data from our HRIS systems, being very, very mindful, right, of privacy and compliance requirements, of course, as always. And we want to address this a few times in the course from a couple of different angles, just so you understand how this will work. Large language models have a component to them called deep learning, and that makes them insatiable learners and consumers of information. So, as it is they're ever solving for and interacting with humanity, they're also continuously scraping the web. They're continuously scraping training sources. And those training sources, in some cases, could be your data. So, we have to be careful, obviously, because we've got some very heavy duty regulatory environments over here in Europe. But quite frankly, I think they are good for us because they force us to be careful in terms of whether or not we sought people's compliance and or engagement, with their information being used in a large language model potentially. But also we have explainability and we have transparency and we have documentation in the event of an audit. And that we're always ever kind of doing that. But we're going to talk a little bit about how it is we ensure that your information is not exposed to the broader world. Because the next step basically is to anonymize the data by removing anything that's personally identifiable. They call it PII, personally identifiable information, and replace that instead with unique IDs, right, to maintain confidentiality. And the other thing is we craft specific targeted questions or prompts that will help extract meaningful and actionable insights from the data using predictive analytics. So we're quite careful in terms of what it is we're asking the large language model to do, right? Because effective prompt engineering is really the essence of success when it comes to large language models. And we always want to kind of make sure that we get the best out of these exercises. And the other thing too is that we also want to make sure to add a financial context and recommendations for our analyses, tying insights directly to business goals and to the bottom line, right? And this will basically help our findings, have a lot more impact and a lot more relevance with our executive teams. And that basically puts us in a very different ballpark and a very different perceptive level, which I think is useful for us. We tend to also then get more resource, we tend to get more time, and we tend to get listened to, which is important. We want to make sure that we're also aware of potential pitfalls, like incomplete or incorrect data, right? That's always ever a challenge in any of the companies I've ever worked for. We were always missing kind of supercritical data. So data hygiene and data gathering becomes absolutely essential. It's existential, right? And we have to make sure that that is first and foremost looked after, and that people whose jobs it is, and that's almost everybody in an organization, to kind of make sure that these data sets are in fact clean and they are available and filled in, that everybody kind of understands just how urgent that is. And in this particular session, we're going to walk through a couple of sample scenarios using our synthetic HR data set. That means basically we've asked the large language model to make up a data set for us, right? And I'm going to show you how it is we anonymize that data set so that we can actually then perform some really interesting insights on it. And we're going to walk you through a couple of examples and scenarios and so forth using this data set, using the latest version of ChatGPT, which is level 5. To demonstrate these practically. Excuse me. I think it's important to kind of note too that, simply reporting and basic analytics provide, again, this backwards view to things. That's us driving down the road at 100 miles an hour with all the other functional leaders in the car, right? And we're staring at the rearview mirror and we're trying to drive in a straight line or to follow the road, which is probably never in a straight line. And it's very, very dangerous for us to do that. The minute we start doing that, we stare back at things in the past. People basically at some point start to dismiss our our functions capacity and capability to help drive the organization forward. Instead, we want to be in a position where we can see around corners that have yet to come. And that kind of helps us. These sort of like analytical models really can kind of help us take our old data and kind of formulate it into potential patterns emerging and start to run different scenarios so we can prepare for all sorts. So dashboards and reports, again, they're somewhat useful, but again, they're reactive. They help us visualize about past events and basically, forecasting in the future is a bit of a reach. But AI, look, is not a magic 8 ball, right? Or even a crystal ball that can simply whip up a perfect view into the future. Quite the opposite, as AI basically can offer us multiple possible scenarios that play out. But again, we're the ones who are supplying the data and asking it what direction we want it to go, as you'll soon see. And then, so creating these scenarios and validating them with our functional leaders will then kind of determine what likely pathways will take place. And importantly, we'll be helping then in strategic and tactical planning, which will then help us understand what we need to do from a people perspective to make sure that we're supporting the business and taking things forward. So let's talk a little bit about predictive HR analytics tools because well, they're rather prolific. There's a lot of them out there. They can be very difficult to implement because, again, they rely heavily on data streams, accurate and complete data streams from a lot of different aspects. And so that makes it sometimes difficult to kind of implement them. And they can be expensive as well. And the thing is that what we want to take a look at is what the particular power or weakness is, relatively speaking, of these various tools. So we kind of understand that none of them are the be all and end all and the perfect solution in every instance, which is why I think it's really important to continuously learn about engaging with large language models. That's absolutely essential. Okay. Um, so let's talk about some of these tools and see basically if any of these things kind of ring a bell. Um, these tools can ingest vast amounts of HR data and identify problems and kind of forecast based on their own algorithmic experience and their best of breed, kind of insights and so forth and experience. They can kind of forecast future workforce trends, right, and help enable proactive planning. So here's a list of, I think, gosh, it was probably about 6 or 7 different folks I plucked from, and there are a heck of a lot more out there on the market, but these are very well known. It's a mixture of enterprise level tools as well as some emerging small to medium sized enterprise tools. Visier is a company that I think I've known them for several years now, 4 or 5 years. And they offer some very, very advanced kind of risk modeling, especially around attrition risk and things of that nature. And they've got some incredibly predictive, kind of insights in terms of things like employee departure risks, sometimes even 6 to 9 months out, based on how it is they view the totality of that person's background. And they do so with like 85% accuracy. It's really quite astounding. But more of a complicated program. And frankly, if your business is quite simple, that's possibly not the best answer. Crunch HR or a cruncher often, kind of provides interactive skills mapping, right, to identify emerging gaps between current capabilities and future business needs, which is super useful for workforce planning. So that could be an interesting option. People Fluent Analytics transforms complex workforce data into compelling strategic stories. And I quite like that. It kind of creates basically a sort of a narrative-driven visualization, which kind of is awesome because that's how my brain works anyway, to kind of understand some of this stuff. Very, very useful. Workalytics uses metadata, right, from collaboration tools to provide objective insights into how the work actually gets done. So they actually get into the themes and the flows, the decision making of work and measuring things like meeting effectiveness and AI adoption, and frankly, whatever it is you want to kind of turn your hand to. Another emerging company out there is called HR Bench, and that combines internal HR data with external benchmarking, which is quite useful. Again, it's not necessarily that the benchmarking is better, smarter, or more capable than you are, but it does give you an indication as to where you stand. And they basically help to optimize HR strategies and competitive positioning. Included is another company that kind of focuses its analytical powers on DEI analytics, specializing in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the insights basically it can draw from that to kind of create an inclusive cultural change over the course of time. And then finally, people metrics, right, which focuses on employment engagement, on retention modeling, and on performance insights to forecast talent risks and optimize people strategies. And that's kind of more the traditional kind of approach. But each one of these tools is powerful in their own right. I'm not advocating for any one in particular. I was just trying to give you sort of a smattering of examples. But they need to be chosen and they need to be applied based on your organization's particular challenge. They aren't inexpensive, and you do need rather to spend significant attention, right, to the installation and to the maintenance of these things. It's crucial because again, data is everything. Which is why kind of learning how to use the LLMs again and targeted queries might be a good first step to kind of understand, what data actually is powerful and meaningful to you. I now kind of want to outline, some of the key steps in setting up a safe and compliant analytics process, working with LLMs on the workforce data that you're going to be looking at. First, we need to kind of make sure, um, how to extract the relevant data from the HRIS system. So we don't need any extra data that frankly has nothing to do with our search. The more specific we can be about this, the better off we're going to be. And we want to focus on metrics like tenure and performance and compensation and team assignments and things of that nature. But we also kind of want to make sure that we cover off the importance of removing all personally identifiable information to maintain privacy and compliance. And that would include things like people's names and email addresses, IDs, and other data that can be identified with the individuals. And then finally, we're also going to talk a little bit about how to replace, personal references with generic team codes, right? Department identifiers and role classifications. So instead of saying somebody's exact job title, vice president of sales for Western Europe, as an example, becomes a executive leadership position, as an example. Okay. So we just kind of genericize some of this. And this allows you basically to preserve the analytical value of the data while staying compliant because you can basically, once you get your information, you can kind of then reverse encrypt it and you can kind of see, who's responsible for what elements of the data. But the overall process really just helps you leverage the full power of of a large language model rather, and the analytics that come from that on your workforce data while, kind of upholding and all the necessary privacy and security measures. Okay, so here's the fun bit. Here's where we actually get into what's going on. You're going to see a couple of prompts over on the left-hand side here, an initial prompt and an iteration for business impact prompt. Okay, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to kind of flip us over into the ChatGPT world, and I want to start showing you what it was we were working on. So now I'll just kind of change my share screen a bit. Shall move myself elsewhere. I needed, in this particular instance, to create a fake or synthetic database of, I chose 200 employees. I don't have that information handy. I don't have it sitting around. And quite frankly, I wasn't about to go try to kind of construct that from scratch using Excel spreadsheets. I just didn't have the time to kind of go do that. So what I've done instead is I wrote a prompt to ChatGPT and said, look, here's what it is I'm trying to do. Provide it context, right? And the more context you can provide any particular prompt, the better. The other thing that you typically want to do in most cases is assign ChatGPT a particular role. So in other words, what I might have done in starting this off is you are an expert in organizational design, as well as analytics related to X, Y, and Z. I didn't have to do it in this case because basically I was using sort of a rolling, kind of contextual framework for this. In other words, I have a folder of a whole bunch of different searches and so forth like this, where I've already identified the role that ChatGPT would take. But I do still always ever need to supply the context. So I explained what the exercise was. I said, look, here's what I'm trying to do, and here's what I need from you. All right, let me just kind of craft that. And within this database of 200 employees, I needed then basically to create headings that contained rather a sort of information that would help me predict um, if any particular individual was at risk of resigning for whatever reason. And so I went and did a quick bit of research and said, what are the typical top reasons? And came up with, oh, I don't know. I think there was like five or six. I think six. Yeah, six or so. And so that being the case, um, it basically, I said, look, create those as headers and then kind of, randomly assign sort of a score associated with that for each of the individuals. Okay. And then I want you then, once you've created the database and created the column headers and so forth, and indicated the measures in terms of how it is people basically fared on those particular, issues or reasons. But it basically said, I'm going to kind of then hit you with another prompt, and I'm going to tell you what it is I'm going to ask you. I'm not going to surprise you with it. And I just kind of spelled it out. And what was cool about that is it then kind of told ChatGPT, okay, this is where this exercise is going. Therefore, this is what I then need to provide in terms of this data set in order to kind of make this work properly. And then I also followed it up and said, and there's sort of an iterative prompt I'm going to hit you with after that. And then, I said, I'm going to also ask your advice on how my company might help proactively reduce risks associated with this. So a lengthy prompt, right? But it was great. It helped me in typing this up think through the challenge and the exercise. And it basically also kind of gave ChatGPT everything it needed to really do some exciting work, which is kind of cool. So that was that. ChatGPT 5 is kind of, by the way, an aggregate of all of the OpenAI models that have been created to date. And so therefore has a variety of different, kind of components to it in that you can get very instant, very quick answers. You can also kind of use the reasoning model and have it really think through things. A lot of the work I was asking it to do kind of fell into the thinking bracket, which typically takes a little bit longer. And that's why you see these highlights, for instance, where it says, I've thought for 18 seconds. And truth, that was like a couple of minutes. And I just didn't want to waste the time here. So that's why I'm kind of scrolling through. But we will have an opportunity to see it work live. So it's given me this database very quickly and said, look, I've already kind of run the analysis for you, but I'm like, okay, still that doesn't necessarily make loads of sense to me. It then actually created some downloads to say, here's a CSV file. And oh, by the way, here's also an Excel, kind of file as well, with a data dictionary sheet. So it kind of helps explain what it is I'm doing. It also then says, which is great for my documentation, it says, this is what my line of thinking was. And these are the criterion I chose based on, each individual kind of column header, and how it was I calculated the scores for each, right? So it was brilliant to kind of have that. I would definitely kind of like save that in a file related to this particular search. And then basically it said, here's how to go ahead and run the two prompts you mentioned on this data set, and said, we're ready to go now. I was like, okay, cool. And I kind of left it at this point, I think, for a couple of days. And that means basically that the links to the spreadsheets and so forth got old, right? And therefore no longer worked. So I said, hey, thanks for all the help and so forth. Would you mind basically firing those up again? And it did, and it kind of refreshed those links. And I just wanted to kind of show you, what it was that it ultimately did. And it created the spreadsheet. And the reason I'm showing you the spreadsheet is it gave this is all stuff that it made up, by the way, and in anticipation of the prompts I was going to ask it. But you will see in the header under employee, it has created a random but unique alphanumeric code for everybody in this group. So there are no names. The departments are actually more sort of, kind of like high level departments. It doesn't go into hyper specific detail. And job families are actually more or less the same. So again, there's no kind of exacting detail. Role levels have again kind of been genericized to manager, senior manager, and individual contributor, director, and that's it, right? So there's no more differentiating than that. So it's really difficult to figure out, who is whom in this. And then it kind of created these headers across the top, which are the reasons for potentially leaving, and then it assigned random scores. Talked about pay increases versus inflation rates, calculated a fairness factor, all sorts of things, and did a really good job of it, which I thought was terrific. And then ultimately came up with a predicted attrition risk, and percentage point, and then kind of then qualified that by following it up with a word, low, moderate, or high in terms of this. So very quickly, if I wanted to, I could just focus on, give me all the folks that are very high. Oh, okay, good. Good news is there's three. Bad news is there's three. And so that I can now look back into and say, geez, what is going on with these individuals? What's happening here? What are the problems? Or we can bounce right back to ChatGPT and we can say, we actually need your help in making sense of all this. Okay. And this is actually what it did. It actually went down the path of really helping me kind of understand the analysis. And it basically predicted, as I was requesting it, what the highest predicted 12-month attrition risk was with the top three contributing factors, right? That was my challenge. And it did it. It literally went department by department. It indicated the risk profile percentage. And then it said, here were the top contributing factors. Fascinating, useful. But is it good enough? Actually, what I need now to do is to kind of understand what the potential financial, kind of risk of this is. And this is, again, where my CFO would be extraordinarily interested, as would my CEO, hopefully everybody at the C-suite level, to understand that if our attrition numbers spike up based on the fact that we are not making any corrections to these reasons up here and sorting this out, this is what potentially we could expect to expend and walk out the door, which is unrecoverable, not to mention sort of the psychological damage already done. But already ChatGPT has helped me through all of this information literally in a matter of minutes. And it's got me to a point where I can actually then take this stuff away and go validate it with finance and start to make sense. And it just gives you a quick takeaway, right? Saying, geez, engineering and sales alone represent the highest financial risk and together accounted for 1.3 million pounds in expected turnover costs for the next year. That's a hell of a headline. I then kind of said, what about a couple of targeted interventions? And it basically came up with two, right? Because these were kind of like, kind of elements that popped up on a regular basis, time and time again. Career growth and mobility framework, manager effectiveness and recognition reset, critical areas. And so, off it goes. It kind of like, further just starts to give me some more wisdom and so forth. And if I wanted to, I could ask it all sorts of questions. Just move my. I could ask it other questions like, okay, so based on your analysis, what urgent actions could the HR team take to immediately reduce the risk of increasing attrition? Let's just see what it comes up with. It's looking at now all the data, all the conversations we have, all of its findings. And it's now said, right, I got you. Urgent actions, right? Different from just general actions. And these are things that can happen in the next 90 days, which is phenomenal. Career clarity conversations, kickstart a recognition reset, addressing, or address leadership tone at the top and kind of figure that out. create learning sprint campaigns, visible wins on pay fairness, start to make adjustments. That's again another conversation with your finance team. These kinds of things. Look, these aren't perfect answers. Let me be clear. But having said that, they are definitely generating in my mind all sorts of interesting ideas, and they've got me a bit on fire about this whole issue. Whereas before, I would have just been exhausted looking it over and over and over and just thinking to myself, what have I missed? And dreading walking into a meeting with my head of finance and having him or her take a look at my data and go, well, you missed this is false. Where's the data for this? All this kind of stuff. And now we have it. We have it all in this conversation. And if I wanted to, I could include somebody in this conversation just by clicking on share and giving them a link to the whole thing. And we could have a really interesting conversation around it. But anyway, that's basically where this whole process, can take us. And that's why this is so much more fun, frankly, than, than just frankly staring at, a blank screen and trying to kind of make sense of things, or simply relying on a vendor, to hopefully kind of get us through, because that's not really sort of exactly where we want to be either. So vendors basically will have these tools and they'll all be preset in terms of the information they ingest, the analytics and the algorithmic outputs that they create. And then basically they'll say, right, these things now fit into these boxes. And the question begs, well, what am I going to do about that? Where do I go with this? What's next? That's why the LLM process is that much more kind of generative and creative in its pathway. So it's a lot more fun from that perspective. Again, let's just kind of revisit the safety elements. One of the things we kind of focus on is creating the 3C rule, which is a framework for setting up large language models safety and ethically, right, in the AI-driven process. So the first thing you always ever want to do when you're kind of thinking about, kind of processes like this, and at some point it will become, rote. You will know your organization's AI usage policy like the back of your hand at some stage. But just double check on the organization's usage policy and data protection guidelines, right, before you implement any kind of an LLM solution. And that would obviously involve, kind of just consulting your legal and compliance team just to make sure you are very clear on what it is you're going to go get from the LLM. And then importantly, that they are clear in terms of what your intent is, because that's also a big function, a big element of these things like the EU AI Act. And you want to just document your approach. And you can ask the LLM to always ever kind of provide you what they call chain of thought, right? And that just basically says, this is basically how the model worked and what it was thinking through and how it got to the data that it got to. The second element is you want to make sure you clean your data, right, by thoroughly anonymizing all of the information, the personally identifiable information, before you process it with an AI system. Remove names and addresses and photos, education dates, and use encrypted ID codes that you understand instead. And then thirdly, we want to make sure that you control the prompts by developing, really well-structured specific prompts that guide the LLM, right, to produce consistent, accurate outputs. And then basically set really clear evaluation criteria in terms of this stuff. Make sure that if you're going to be measuring people against one another or against some, I don't know, some kind of a model that you've kind of built, you want to make sure that the weightings are accurate. You want to make sure that you're thinking through end to end. Are we kind of positioning this data correctly such that the outputs are going to make sense in terms of what it is we're looking to assess? Okay. So following a systemic, kind of 3C process really kind of ensures that your AI practices remain compliant and ethical and effective. The other thing that we always ever want to introduce, post a training session is a 7-day action plan, right? That we basically use to help you with the process of playing around with data in this particular instance. And in this case, we're looking at HR analytics. So, the first thing is to kind of pick a metric that really matters to the business. What's on fire at the moment? What's problematic? Is it something related to attrition risk or skills gap analysis, or maybe your DEI pipeline health? Don't know. But whatever it is, pick one. You don't have to start with your own data set first if you're uncomfortable with the anonymization of that data. If you are more comfortable, creating a synthetic data source, that's something that your large language model can do for you, as we've shown with ChatGPT. So go ahead and do that first and get comfortable with it and watch how it basically anonymizes critical columns so that you get some ideas as to how it is you can kind of do your own, which would be good. And if you still have any questions, you can always ever reach out to an expert. You can always ever double check with your IT team or, whoever is sort of expert, excuse me, about AI, um, can be super helpful in that regard. And then the second step, you always ever kind of like, or sorry, the final step is that you want to present the AI generated predictions alongside your existing HR reporting and highlight the value of the new predictive insights. In other words, show what's changing in terms of the way that you're kind of interrogating your own data, and the data that you're gathering through the AI tool. Um, See if that makes sense. And just have a go, have a play with it. Involve a couple of people in the department. Get people comfortable with this stuff. Because trust me when I tell you, it doesn't take long for you to start to feel reasonably expert at how to do some of these things. And the results that you get are kind of wild, kind of game changing. So look, today we explored how AI-powered analytics can really transform HR from being a reactive reporting, kind of approach to a much more proactive, strategic, and scenario planning approach, right? The key, I think, to the analytics really kind of tells us, AI basically will give us a glimpse into the future, but it's fueled and fed by accurate, abundant data from the past. So make sure your data hygiene is up to par, which is critical, and make sure you then kind of like build out the patterns, excuse me, and make them predictive, as to where the data can then lead us. And by harnessing that data, right, the power of those predictive analytics, we can really kind of anticipate workforce changes, based on the patterns of the past. And it doesn't have to come directly from our own brains. It can very well come from the power of AI's ability to kind of look across a multitude of different data sources and to make sense of these things in ways, frankly, we would really struggle to in a matter of minutes. Okay. And then we also want to be able to quantify the potential costs of these challenges with our finance team, right? And then implement targeted interventions that are going to show the company how we're going to de-risk, and hopefully reduce, potential expenditure that is unrecoverable. Okay. So the end result, hopefully, is that you as HR leaders become much more strategic, much more impactful, and much more aligned to kind of, critical business objectives and business problems. And that basically is the focus of the HR analytics predictive intelligence, training course. So thank you very much for participating. It was wonderful to spend some time with you. If you could do us a favor, please take a quick moment to click on our feedback button below, and just answer a few questions about this course and whether or not you think it would be worth building out. But importantly, if you could give us some corrective tips and tricks and things of that nature, we can always ever improve what it is we're doing. Much appreciated, and I wish you a great rest of your day.